In this lesson, we're going to break some code with conditionals. In this lesson, we will learn the common errors with conditional statements, how to break the code and create errors, and how to fix the code in EarSketch. Before we start breaking the code, let's do a quick recap of our sample code to see what it should do when it's working properly. We use the input function with the prompt that says, choose a genre, house, electro, or hip hop. Remember that the input function will create a pop-up window with a prompt that tells the user what type of information they need to type into the field. The prompt will be a label on the pop-up window that tells the user to choose a genre, house, electro, or hip hop. The user input, whatever the user types into the field in the pop-up window, will be assigned to a variable called request. We use a conditional to check the value of request. In other words, the Python interpreter will take different actions depending on what the user has typed into the pop-up window. The Python interpreter will change the values of the variables main beat and tempo depending on which genre the user chooses. If the user does not choose house or electro, then the default is hip hop. Finally, it prints the current values of these two variables, main beat and tempo. It uses the values of main beat and tempo as the arguments for the fit media and set tempo functions. There are lots of interesting ways to break conditionals. This is my favorite part of breaking code. With conditionals, you can learn so much from breaking them in a wide variety of ways. Let's start with indentation errors. The block of code after each conditional statement, as in the if, elif, else statements, needs to be indented for spaces, just the way we've seen with the indented blocks of code in for loops and while loops. If you don't indent the blocks of code underneath the colon in a conditional statement, you'll get a parse error in EarSketch. Again, error messages are like clues. It's not always clear what the error is, especially when so many of the errors we see in EarSketch are parse errors. The best clue we have on this one in particular is that it's highlighting line 23, so we have an idea of what went wrong. It is on that line, or maybe directly above it. What if you have two equal signs after the else, as in else equals house, for example? In this example, our code reads like this: else request equals electro, followed by a colon. We get a parse error again, this time on line 25. If you make this error, it may be tough to spot. The Python keyword elif looks a lot like else. But notice the difference between these two statements. On line 25, it says else request equals electro, followed by a colon. And on line 28, it says else, followed by a colon. Remember, with else, it's not checking a specific condition. It is simply saying that if nothing else in the previous conditional statements are true, then do this next. So else is a much simpler statement. You just type in else, followed by a colon, followed by the indented block of code below. So going back to line 25, we can see by comparison that this must be a typo. Else request equals electro, followed by a colon, is clearly wrong. That should have been an elif. We change our code to elif request equals electro, followed by a colon, so we've broken it and fixed it back again. What if we misspelled else and typed in elif instead, as in elif followed by a colon, for example? We can see here that we have elif immediately followed by a colon. We get a parse error. When we see a parse error, it's normally a simple typo like this one, but it can be tough to spot sometimes. Sometimes you might have to look at the screen for a while, or ask a friend, or talk through your code out loud, or sometimes you just need to take a break and come back to it. What if we make a mistake and we have a single equal sign when we really should have a double equal sign, as in this example, if request equals house? In this example, we accidentally type in a single equal sign when we need a double equal sign. We typed in if request equals house, followed by a colon, and again we see that it's another parse error. We correct our code and add another equal sign. So it now says if request equals house. Remember, if you want to check if one value equals another, you need to use two equal signs. You can think of a double equal sign as asking a question, does this thing equal this other thing? I always remember it as it Does it really equal? And that reminds me that it's two equal signs. And we have a single equal sign with variables. In this case, we're telling EarSketch what the value of a variable is. So remember, with one equal sign, you're telling Python the value. With a double equal sign, you're asking Python if two values are the same. We can create an error if we're missing the colon at the end of a conditional statement. So remember, the first line of code in for loops, while loops, and conditionals all end in a colon. That's the symbol with two dots on top of the other. We can see that we get a parse error, also known as a syntax error. To fix it, make sure that each line of code starts with if, elif, or else, and has a colon at the end. We're now going to show you a lot of weird and interesting examples of bugs and errors that you will create if you mix up the order of if, elif, and else. When you understand why this is not working, you will have a much better understanding of the logic of conditionals and how they work. Let's see what happens if we start with an elif instead of an if. In this example, it may be difficult to see, but if you look closely and read the code line by line, the way a Python interpreter reads it, you can see that we started with an elif instead of an if. We see a parse error on line 26 in this example. What's happening here? Notice the previous line of code is not indented. When the Python interpreter reads this line of code that's not indented, it interprets the unindented code as indicating that the first block of code is done. In other words, it seems to the Python interpreter that we had a conditional with just an if statement with no elif or else. It then goes to line 26 and it reads this line of code. Elif request equals electro, followed by a colon. So Python interprets this line of code as a new conditional statement. But remember, a conditional needs to start with if, not elif, as in if, elif, else. This is why we see a parse error on line 26, because this conditional statement says elif, else, instead of if, elif, else. Let's see what happens if we have an else followed by an elif. In this example, we have another parse error. We have an elif after an else. The pattern in conditionals is if, elif, else. Else finishes this conditional statement on line 25. A new conditional statement would need to start with if, not elif. That's why we get a parse error on line 29. We're not following the rules of Python for conditionals. Let's see what happens if we forget to use else. Let's break the code by removing the else statement. So now our code has a conditional that checks to see if request is equal to house or electro, but it does not have an else statement to default to hip hop. When we run the code and type in the words hip hop, we get a name error. Name main beat is not defined on line 31. So what happened? In our example, we create the main beat variable and assign the sound file to it, either house or electro, based on what the user types into the field. We don't have an else statement, so if the user does not type in house or electro, the main beat variable is not created. So we get that name error. Let's see what happens if we use more than one if in our conditional. This last example, it's interesting because it's not necessarily the wrong way to code a conditional. In this example, we only use if statements. So it's all ifs. If. There are lots of reasons why you might want to only use if statements. Sometimes it's just a simpler and more clear way to code. However, if you're not careful, it could lead to some unintended buggy behavior. In this example, if we choose house, electro, or hip hop, it'll work as expected. So for example, if we run the code and choose hip hop, then it will work as expected and it will play the hip hop beat. But what if we wanted our program to default to hip hop, as in play hip hop if the user doesn't choose house or electro? So let's test it by typing gibberish, just a scramble of letters. We get a name error. Main beat is not defined. Since we didn't select house, electro, or hip hop, then the main beat variable is not created, so we get a name error. We can fix this by reverting to the if, elif, else statement that we had in our original code. In this lesson, we learned the common errors with conditional statements, how to break the code and create errors, and how to fix the code in EarSketch. We'll see you again on Breakbeat Code.